Photographers were already gathering outside when Imani Jefferson walked into the Quinn Technologies boardroom, visibly pregnant, and carrying the patents that would change everything. Andrew Quinn watched the woman he loved place evidence of his family's 20-year fraud on the mahogany table. "Choose," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Your family's money or our child's future." The hostile takeover was the least of his problems now, because the mother of his unborn child was about to expose the truth that would either destroy his empire or set them both free. 18 months earlier, Seattle's rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Quinn Technologies as Andrew Quinn reviewed the quarterly contracts that had built his empire. At 36, he commanded boardrooms with the same intensity that had transformed his father's collapsed engineering firm into a $200 million licensing powerhouse. His steel-gray eyes swept across documents that his mind struggled to process fully, the letters sometimes dancing in ways that reminded him why he trusted his legal team completely. The knock on his office door interrupted his concentration. "Mr. Quinn? Your new executive assistant is here." Andrew straightened his custom charcoal suit and set aside the patent renewal documents that formed the backbone of Quinn Technologies' success. For nearly 2 years, these quarterly ceremonies had funded everything: the penthouse office, the private jet, the family estate in Bellevue. His signature on these renewals represented millions in licensing fees from technology patents his lawyers assured him were legitimately acquired decades ago. "Send her in." Imani Jefferson entered with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in corporate boardrooms, despite the modest dress that suggested this position represented a significant step up for her. Her warm brown skin seemed to glow under the office lighting, and her natural hair was styled in an elegant twist that framed expressive dark eyes. She was beautiful, certainly, but something deeper caught Andrew's attention: an intelligence that assessed everything with careful precision. "Mr. Quinn, I'm Imani Jefferson. Thank you for this opportunity." Her voice carried warmth, tinged with something he couldn't identify: determination, perhaps, or purpose that extended beyond secretarial duties. "Welcome to Quinn Technologies." He extended his hand, noting how her fingers lingered just a moment longer than professional courtesy required. "Your qualifications are impressive. MBA from University of Washington. Technology sector experience. You're overqualified for this position." A shadow crossed her features. "Sometimes we take positions that serve purposes beyond the obvious ones." The comment intrigued him, though he filed it away as they discussed her responsibilities. She would handle his calendar, review contracts for scheduling purposes, and coordinate with the legal team on quarterly patent renewals. Standard executive assistant duties. Yet something in her manner suggested she understood the technical aspects better than most. "These patent renewals," she gestured toward the documents on his desk, "they seem quite complex. Do you handle the technical review personally?" Andrew felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied discussions of detailed document analysis. "I focus on the business strategy and client relationships. My legal team handles the technical specifications and patent authenticity verification. They've been with my family for 20 years. I trust their expertise completely." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on the signature lines that bore his name. "Of course, trust is essential in family business relationships." Over the following weeks, their professional partnership developed into something more complex than either had anticipated. Andrew found himself looking forward to their morning coffee ritual, when Imani would brief him on the day's contracts, while they stood close enough for him to catch the subtle scent of her perfume. Her competence impressed him. She grasped technical concepts quickly and asked questions that revealed deep understanding of intellectual property law. "You seem unusually interested in patent processes for an executive assistant," he observed one morning as she organized renewal documents with methodical precision. "My father was an engineer," she replied, her voice softening. "I grew up understanding the value of intellectual property. Innovation should be protected and properly attributed." Something in her tone suggested personal experience with that protection being violated, but when he looked closer, she had returned to professional efficiency. Still, he noticed how she studied each document he signed, particularly the quarterly patent renewals that sustained Quinn Technologies' profitability. Their intellectual compatibility became obvious during client meetings, where Amani's insights often guided Andrew toward strategic decisions he might have missed. She had an engineer's mind wrapped in business acumen, a combination that complemented his own strengths perfectly. When his dyslexia made contract details challenging to process quickly, her summaries provided clarity without making him feel diminished. "You understand these technologies better than most of my senior staff," he told her after a particularly successful client presentation. "Have you considered moving into a technical role here?" "I'm exactly where I need to be," she responded, but her smile seemed tinged with sadness. By the third month, Andrew realized that Amani Jefferson represented something he hadn't expected to find: an intellectual equal who challenged him professionally while creating emotional responses he struggled to suppress. When she leaned over his desk to point out contract details, her proximity sent awareness through him that had nothing to do with business. When she laughed at his attempts at humor during late-night work sessions, the sound made him forget about everything except making her laugh again. The quarterly patent renewal ceremony in November crystallized both his growing attraction and her mysterious purpose. As he signed the licensing agreements that generated millions for Quinn Technologies, Amani observed with an intensity that seemed almost painful. Her careful documentation of the process, timestamping each signature, noting witness presence, recording board approval procedures, went far beyond normal administrative duties. "Is there something specific you're tracking?" he asked as she photographed the signed documents. "Just ensuring complete record-keeping," she replied, but her hands shook slightly as she handled papers that contained his signature, authorizing another quarter's worth of patent licensing fees. That evening, as Seattle's early winter darkness settled over the city, they found themselves alone in the office, reviewing client contracts for the following week. The building's heating system created an intimate atmosphere, and their conversation drifted from business strategy to personal revelation. "Why Quinn Technologies?" Andrew asked as they shared Chinese takeout at the conference table. "You could work anywhere with your qualifications." Imani was quiet for a long moment, watching rain streak the windows. "Sometimes justice requires patience and proximity." "Justice?" She met his eyes directly. "Making sure the right people receive credit for their innovations. That stolen work gets returned to its rightful owners. That the truth comes out, even when it's painful." The intensity in her voice suggested personal investment that went beyond philosophical commitment to intellectual property rights. Andrew felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, though he couldn't identify why her words seemed to carry warning. "You sound like someone who's been personally affected by patent theft." "My father's life work disappeared into corporate legal files 20 years ago," she said quietly. "Brilliant innovations that could have changed everything. Instead, they enriched people who never created anything." Andrew's chest tightened with unexpected sympathy. "I'm sorry. That kind of theft destroys more than just financial prospects. It steals recognition, legacy, family security." "Yes," she whispered. "It does exactly that." The moment stretched between them, loaded with unspoken understanding and growing attraction that both were fighting to maintain within professional boundaries. When Imani reached across the table to touch his hand in comfort, Andrew felt electrical awareness that had nothing to do with sympathy, and everything to do with the woman whose mysterious purpose was becoming tangled with feelings neither had planned. "We should probably head home," she said, but neither moved to break the connection of their hands. "Probably," he agreed, while thinking that the last thing he wanted was for this moment to end. As autumn deepened into winter, their relationship danced around boundaries that became increasingly difficult to maintain. Late evening work sessions transformed into intimate conversations about family, ambition, and the ethical complexities of corporate success. Andrew found himself sharing vulnerabilities about his dyslexia that he had never discussed with employees, while Imani revealed her father's engineering brilliance with a mixture of pride and pain that suggested unresolved grief. The December patent renewal ceremony brought their complicated dynamics into sharp focus. As Andrew signed quarterly licensing agreements worth $12 million, Imani's documentation became almost obsessive. She recorded every aspect of the process: his review procedures, his consultation with legal staff, his signature patterns, his apparent understanding of the technical content. "You seem unusually focused on these particular contracts," Andrew observed as she photographed each page before filing. "They represent significant value," she replied. "Important to maintain complete records for such substantial intellectual property licensing." Her explanation was reasonable, but Andrew noticed how her voice caught slightly when she handled documents bearing his signature. Something about these quarterly renewals affected her deeply, though he couldn't understand why standard business procedures would create such emotional responses. That night, working late again on client presentations, their professional facades finally began to crack under the weight of months of suppressed attraction and growing emotional intimacy. "Andrew," she said softly, as they reviewed technology specifications, "do you ever question where your success comes from?" The unexpected personal direction surprised him. "Every day. My father's firm collapsed when I was 16. Everything I've built since then feels like I'm trying to prove that failure wasn't inevitable." "And if you discovered that your success was built on something that wasn't entirely legitimate?" Her question sent ice through his veins. "What do you mean?" "Hypothetically, if you learned that the foundation of your business involved ethical complications you weren't aware of, would you want to know?" Andrew studied her face, noting the tension that suggested this hypothetical question carried personal weight. Truth is always better than comfortable ignorance, even when it's painful. Even if that truth could destroy everything you've worked to build. "Especially then," he said firmly. "I'd rather lose everything honestly than keep anything through deception." Tears gathered in her eyes, and Andrew felt compelled to move closer, his hand reaching to cup her cheek in comfort for whatever pain his answer had triggered. "Imani, what's wrong? Is someone threatening you? Is there something about Quinn Technologies that concerns you?" She started, then stopped, leaning into his touch in a way that sent warmth through both of them. "I can't, not yet." The space between them seemed to disappear as months of suppressed attraction finally demanded acknowledgement. Her breath trembled as his thumb traced her cheekbone, and Andrew felt his professional restraint dissolving under the intensity of emotions that had been building since her first day. "We shouldn't," she whispered, but her body betrayed her words by moving closer. "No," he agreed roughly, "we probably shouldn't." The kiss that followed broke through every barrier they had constructed, tender and desperate, and charged with months of denied attraction. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Andrew recognized that whatever professional boundaries had existed between them had just been permanently altered. "This complicates everything," Imani whispered against his mouth. "Everything was already complicated," he replied, pulling her closer. "This just makes it worth the complications." But even as he spoke, Andrew sensed that complications he couldn't yet imagine were already reshaping everything he thought he understood about his business, his success, and the woman whose mysterious purpose was becoming inseparable from his heart. 8 months of working together had transformed their professional partnership into something that defied every boundary they had attempted to maintain. Andrew found himself creating reasons to extend their evening work sessions, while Imani struggled to balance her growing love with the systematic documentation that would eventually destroy him. Her evidence file now contained detailed records of his involvement in quarterly patent renewals, each signature ceremony bringing her closer to the legal proof Rick Caldwell demanded, while breaking her heart piece by piece. "You're working too hard," Andrew observed one February evening as she organized contracts from their latest client presentation. The snow falling outside created a cocoon of intimacy in his office, and the warm lighting cast shadows that made her seem almost ethereal. "These deals are important," she replied, though her true focus was on documenting his signature patterns and decision-making processes. Every quarterly renewal ceremony provided more evidence of his personal involvement in patent licensing, evidence that would prove criminal conspiracy regardless of his unknowing participation. Andrew moved behind her chair, his hands settling on her shoulders with the familiarity of someone who had earned the right to touch her with such casual intimacy. Important enough to sacrifice your health? You've been here every night this week. The irony of his concern wasn't lost on her. She was sacrificing far more than her health. She was methodically building the case that would send the man she loved to prison. Someone has to keep track of all these licensing agreements. The quarterly renewals alone generate significant paperwork. His hands stilled on her shoulders. Is there something specific about those renewals that concerns you? Imani's pulse quickened. 3 more quarterly ceremonies had passed since their first kiss, and her documentation now showed a clear pattern of his personal involvement in patent licensing decisions. Board meeting minutes, witness statements, client communications, all proving that Andrew Quinn personally managed the intellectual property agreements that formed the foundation of his company's success. Just thorough record-keeping, she said carefully. Your legal team seems very invested in maintaining these particular licensing arrangements. They should be. Those patents represent the core of Quinn Technologies' value proposition. My lawyers have assured me they're all legitimately acquired, though honestly, the technical specifications are beyond my expertise. He began massaging the tension from her shoulders, unaware that his touch was both comfort and torment for someone documenting his legal vulnerability. Imani closed her eyes, savoring his touch while hating herself for the deception. Have you ever personally verified the original patent acquisitions? Why would I? My family's legal team handled all intellectual property matters before I took over the business. I trust their expertise completely. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never imagined that trust could be weaponized against him. The March quarterly renewal ceremony proved to be a turning point in both their relationship and her evidence gathering. As Andrew signed licensing agreements worth $15 million, Imani documented every aspect of the process with her usual thoroughness. But this time, she also noticed details that made her stomach twist with dread. The patent numbers on the agreements matched entries in her father's journal, innovations Marcus Jefferson had developed 20 years ago for an engineering firm that had mysteriously collapsed just before his death. The technology Andrew was licensing belonged to her father, stolen and repackaged through legal manipulation that had made the Quinn family wealthy while destroying hers. Everything looks in order, Andrew said as he completed the signatures, unaware that he had just renewed licenses for technology that had been stolen from the woman he was falling in love with. Yes, Imani whispered, photographing each page with hands that shook slightly. Everything is exactly as it appears. That evening, working late again on client presentations, their conversation took an unexpectedly personal turn when Andrew mentioned his father's engineering background. He was brilliant with technical innovation, but terrible with business operations, Andrew explained as they reviewed patent portfolios for potential clients. When his firm collapsed, it nearly destroyed our family, financially. Everything I've built since then has been about proving that good engineering combined with solid business practices can create lasting success. Imani felt tears gathering as she realized that Andrew genuinely believed his success was built on legitimate foundations. His father's firm had collapsed around the same time her father's patents had been stolen. Connections that formed a picture too terrible to contemplate. What caused his firm to collapse? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Legal troubles, according to my mother. Something about patent disputes and intellectual property claims that became too expensive to fight. My father never talked about the details. I think the failure broke something in him. The truth crystallized with devastating clarity. Andrew's father hadn't been the thief. He had been another victim, destroyed by the same criminal conspiracy that had stolen her father's work. The Quinn family's subsequent wealth had been built on the foundation of both their fathers. Destruction orchestrated by Rick Caldwell and the legal team that still managed Andrew's contracts. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion for both their father's suffering. Why are you crying? Andrew moved closer, his concern genuine as he cupped her face in his hands. Sometimes justice is more complicated than it appears, she said, leaning into his touch despite knowing how much pain her ultimate betrayal would cause them both. Imani, what's wrong? You've been tense for weeks. Is someone pressuring you? Threatening you? His protective instincts had intensified as their relationship deepened, making her deception infinitely more painful. There are things about this company, about these patents, that you don't understand, she said carefully. Then help me understand. Whatever it is, we can face it together. The tenderness in his voice nearly broke her resolve. Here was a man offering to fight battles he didn't even comprehend, willing to risk everything for someone whose true purpose would destroy him. Some battles have to be fought alone. Not anymore, he said firmly, pulling her closer. Not if you don't want to. The kiss that followed was different from their previous stolen moments, deeper, more desperate, carrying the weight of unspoken truths and growing love that made everything else impossibly complicated. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Imani recognized that she was past the point of choosing between justice and love. She would have to find a way to achieve both, or lose everything that mattered. Have you ever fallen for someone you were supposed to resist? Share your experience in the comments. April brought new pressures that tested every aspect of their secret relationship. Rick Caldwell made his first direct contact with Imani, confirming that he knew exactly who she was and what evidence she had been gathering. His message was simple: provide the complete documentation file within 60 days, or he would expose her identity and destroy a chance of criminal prosecution. You've done excellent work documenting his involvement, Caldwell said during their clandestine meeting at a downtown Seattle coffee shop. But we need proof of knowing participation, not just signatures. The quarterly renewals show pattern, but we need evidence that he understands what he's authorizing. He trusts his legal team completely, Imani protested. His dyslexia makes detailed technical review challenging, so he focuses on business strategy while delegating legal compliance. Then we'll have to create circumstances that force him to confront the technical details personally, Caldwell replied with cold calculation. Perhaps a crisis that requires him to verify patent authenticity without his usual legal support. The conversation left Imani feeling sick with dread. Caldwell wasn't interested in justice. He wanted revenge that would destroy Andrew personally, while positioning himself to acquire Quinn Technologies at a fraction of its value. She was being used as a weapon against the man she loved, and time was running out to find another solution. Meanwhile, Andrew's mother Victoria had begun expressing suspicions about Imani's background and unusual interest in company documentation. During a tense family dinner at the Quinn estate, her questioning became increasingly direct. Your qualifications seemed quite advanced for an executive assistant position, Victoria observed as they dined on the terrace overlooking Lake Washington. MBA from University of Washington, technology sector experience. One might wonder why someone with such credentials would accept a support role. Sometimes the right opportunity is about more than job title, Imani replied carefully, aware that Andrew was watching the exchange with growing tension. Indeed. And what would constitute the right opportunity for someone with your background? Mother, Andrew interrupted, his voice carrying warning. Imani's qualifications are exactly why Quinn Technologies is fortunate to have her. Of course, dear. I'm simply curious about what attracts such talented individuals to our little family business. Victoria's smile was sharp as she turned back to Imani. Your father was in technology as well, wasn't he? Imani's pulse quickened. He was an engineer. How fascinating. What type of engineering? Perhaps something related to the technologies we license? The question hung in the air like a threat, and Imani realized that Victoria Quinn was far more dangerous than she had anticipated. He worked on various projects. Nothing that would be familiar to you. You'd be surprised what I'm familiar with, dear. The technology sector in Seattle has always been quite small. Interconnected, one might say. That night, as Andrew walked her to her car, his frustration was evident. I apologize for my mother's interrogation. She's become increasingly protective of the business as we've grown more successful. She's concerned about protecting your family's interests, Imani said, understanding Victoria's motivations better than Andrew realized. You're not a threat to her interests. You've been nothing but beneficial to Quinn Technologies. He pulled her closer, his voice softening. And to me personally. Their kiss in the parking garage was tender and desperate, both sensing external pressures that threatened to tear them apart, while being unable to discuss the true nature of those threats. When they separated, Imani saw love and trust in Andrew's eyes that made her deception feel like a physical wound. The crisis that would change everything began building in late April, when Seattle experienced the worst spring storm in decades. As Andrew prepared to leave the office early due to weather warnings, their major client, TechFlow Corporation, called with an emergency that would test every aspect of their relationship. "They're threatening to cancel our contract," Andrew explained grimly, as wind howled outside his office windows. "A competitor is claiming our patent licenses are fraudulent, that the original technology was stolen decades ago." Imani's blood turned to ice. What kind of proof are they demanding? Independent verification of patent authenticity, original acquisition documentation, proof that our licensing agreements are legitimate. He ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "My legal team is unreachable due to the storm, and TechFlow needs answers by tomorrow morning, or they'll terminate $12 million in annual contracts." This was the moment Caldwell had engineered, circumstances that would force Andrew to confront the technical details of patent authenticity without his usual legal protection. Imani watched the man she loved struggle with documentation that would reveal the truth she had been hiding. Knowing that helping him meant betraying her mission, while abandoning him meant watching him suffer unnecessarily. "I could help you review the patent documentation," she offered quietly. Andrew looked up from the contracts with surprise and relief. "Would you? I know it's beyond your normal responsibilities, but your technical background." "Of course," she said, her heart breaking as she realized this moment would either save him or destroy them both. As the storm raged outside, they worked together through the night, Andrew trusting her guidance while she navigated the terrible knowledge that every document they reviewed contained evidence of the theft that had destroyed her father. When he struggled with technical specifications due to his dyslexia, she provided summaries that helped him understand without revealing her complete knowledge. When client pressure mounted, she helped him craft responses that bought time without admitting vulnerability. Their intellectual partnership reached new depths as they functioned as equals facing crisis together. Andrew's strategic brilliance combined with her technical expertise created solutions neither could have achieved alone. For brief moments, Imani allowed herself to imagine what their relationship could become if built on honesty rather than deception. "You're incredible," Andrew said during a quiet moment as they shared coffee at 3 a.m. "I don't know how I managed without you." "You're stronger than you realize," she replied, meaning every word despite the circumstances. "Your dyslexia doesn't diminish your intelligence or your ethical instincts. Sometimes I wonder if my learning challenges make me vulnerable to mistakes, trusting people I shouldn't trust, missing details that matter." Imani felt tears gathering as she realized he was describing exactly what had happened to him. "Trust isn't weakness, Andrew. It's what makes you a good person in a world that often rewards the opposite." The tender moments stretched between them, loaded with unspoken truths and growing love that transcended their impossible circumstances. When Andrew leaned closer, his intention clear, Imani didn't resist. Their kiss was different this time, deeper, more desperate, carrying months of suppressed passion and the recognition that external forces were trying to tear them apart. When professional boundaries finally dissolved completely under the weight of crisis and attraction, neither had the strength to maintain pretenses that had become meaningless. "We shouldn't," Imani whispered, as Andrew's hands framed her face. "We've been fighting this for months," he replied roughly. "Tonight, I just want to stop fighting." What followed was a complete surrender to feelings that had been building since her first day at Quinn Technologies. In his private office, with Seattle's storm creating a sanctuary isolated from the world, they discovered what it meant to love without reservation. Their physical connection was tender and passionate, a recognition of the intellectual and emotional partnership that had developed despite impossible circumstances. Afterward, as they lay together on the office couch with the storm slowly subsiding outside, Imani felt the full weight of her deception crushing down. She loved this man completely, his ethical nature, his protective instincts, his willingness to trust despite past betrayals. And she was documenting evidence that would send him to prison for crimes he committed unknowingly. "I love you," Andrew whispered against her hair, his arms tightening around her. "I love you too," she replied, the words both truth and betrayal. "More than you could possibly understand." But even as they held each other in the aftermath of complete emotional and physical surrender, Imani knew that morning would bring the consequences of choices made long before they met. The evidence she had gathered was nearly complete. Caldwell's deadline was approaching, and Victoria's suspicions were escalating toward dangerous territory. The night that had sealed their fate was also the beginning of the end of everything they were trying to protect. 4 months of secret relationship brought Andrew and Imani a happiness neither had expected to find. Even as the evidence of his legal culpability mounted with each passing day, their private moments together, dinners at her modest apartment, weekend drives along the coast, stolen kisses in empty conference rooms, created a sanctuary from the corporate pressures that threatened to destroy everything they were building. "Your mother loves you deeply," Imani observed one Sunday evening as they cooked dinner together in her kitchen. She had spent the afternoon meeting Dr. Sarah Mitchell, whose warm approval of Andrew was tempered by maternal concern about relationships built on necessary deceptions. "She's protective," Andrew replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she stirred pasta sauce. "Losing my father when I was young made her hypervigilant about threats to family security." Imani leaned back against his chest, savoring the domestic intimacy while her heart broke with the knowledge that she represented exactly the kind of threat his mother feared. "She raised an exceptional son. She worries I'm too trusting, that my learning challenges make me vulnerable to people who might exploit my weaknesses." The irony of his words wasn't lost on her. She was documenting evidence that would prove exactly that kind of exploitation, though the perpetrators weren't who either of them suspected. "Trust isn't weakness, Andrew. It's what makes you capable of real love." Their evening conversations often drifted to dreams of the future. Andrew's vision of expanding Quinn Technologies ethically, Imani's carefully edited hopes for justice and recognition. She never mentioned that justice would require destroying the man she loved, or that recognition for her father's work would come at the cost of Andrew's freedom. The workplace challenges of maintaining their secret relationship while she continued documenting his legal vulnerability created constant tension. Andrew desperately wanted to promote her and acknowledge their partnership publicly, but Imani needed continued access to patent documentation for her evidence file. "You're overqualified for administrative work," he insisted during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "I want to create a position that matches your capabilities. Chief Technology Officer, maybe Vice President of Innovation." "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, though accepting promotion would have ended her access to the quarterly renewal ceremonies that formed the backbone of her case against him. The August quarterly renewal brought her documentation to a critical threshold. As Andrew signed licensing agreements worth $18 million, Imani recorded the 8th ceremony in her systematic evidence gathering. Her file now contained everything Rick Caldwell had demanded: timestamps, witness statements, board minutes, client communications proving Andrew's personal involvement in patent licensing decisions. "These renewals seem to generate more paperwork each quarter," Andrew observed as she photographed the signed documents with unusual thoroughness. "The licensing agreements are becoming more complex," she replied, her voice steady, despite the knowledge that she now possessed legally sufficient evidence for criminal prosecution. "Important to maintain complete records." What he didn't know was that every signature he placed on those documents created another layer of legal culpability, regardless of his unknowing participation in fraud. Federal prosecutors would focus on the pattern of personal involvement, not his intent or understanding. The pressure from multiple directions intensified as autumn approached. Caldwell's demands became more urgent, reminding Imani that his hostile takeover timeline was accelerating and he needed her complete evidence file. Victoria's surveillance increased, with new security protocols that monitored computer access and questioned Imani's background research activities. I've been thinking about your family history, Victoria said during another tense dinner at the Quinn estate. Jefferson is such a distinguished name in Seattle's technology community. Your father must have worked with many of the companies in our sector. He was passionate about innovation, Imani replied carefully, aware that Andrew was listening with growing concern about his mother's persistent interrogation. Innovation is such a valuable commodity. Terrible when brilliant work doesn't receive proper recognition, don't you think? Victoria's smile was cold as she continued. Though I suppose justice has a way of finding the right people eventually. The thread in her words was unmistakable, and Imani realized that Victoria Quinn knew far more about her identity and purpose than she had revealed. The family matriarch was playing a dangerous game, testing how much Imani understood while preparing her own defensive strategies. That night, working late again on client contracts, Andrew's frustration with his mother's behavior boiled over. I don't understand why she's targeting you with these pointed questions. You've done nothing but excel in your position here. She's protecting her family's business interests, Imani said, understanding Victoria's motivations with painful clarity. You're not a threat to our business. You've made everything stronger, more efficient, more profitable. He moved closer, his voice dropping to the intimate tone that never failed to send warmth through her. And you've made me happier than I've ever been. Their kiss in the empty office was tender and desperate, both sensing external pressures building toward an inevitable explosion, while being unable to discuss the true nature of those pressures. When Andrew pulled her closer, his touch conveying love and trust that made her deception feel like a physical wound, Imani wondered how much longer she could maintain the balance between her mission and her heart. The crisis began building in October, when Imani's pregnancy symptoms became unmistakable. Morning sickness during board meetings, fatigue that no amount of coffee could combat, emotional volatility that she struggled to hide behind professional competence. The timing was devastating. Her evidence file was complete, Caldwell's deadline was approaching, and Victoria's suspicions were escalating toward dangerous territory. The doctor's confirmation came on a gray Seattle morning that felt heavy with impending change. Congratulations, Miss Jefferson. You're approximately 8 weeks pregnant. Imani sat in her car afterward, staring at the ultrasound image while her world shifted on its axis. She loved Andrew completely and wanted nothing more than to share this joy with him. But pregnancy meant he would want marriage and public acknowledgement of their relationship, which would trigger Victoria's retaliation and expose Imani's true identity before the criminal case was ready. The confrontation she had been dreading came 3 days later, when Victoria requested a private meeting in her office. The family matriarch's investigation had clearly reached its conclusion, and her expression was granite hard as she presented a file folder across her desk. Imani Jefferson, Victoria said coldly, daughter of Marcus Jefferson, deceased engineer whose patent portfolio mysteriously disappeared 20 years ago. MBA from University of Washington. Technology sector experience gained through systematic research into Quinn Technologies' intellectual property holdings. Imani's pulse roared in her ears, but she maintained steady eye contact. Mrs. Quinn, did you really think we wouldn't discover who you are? That your little evidence-gathering project would go unnoticed forever? Victoria's voice was sharp with controlled fury. I know exactly what you've been documenting and exactly who you're working with. Then you know I'm seeking justice for my father's stolen work. Justice? Victoria laughed bitterly. You've been systematically seducing my son while building a criminal case against him. Do you call that justice? The accusation hit like a physical blow because it contained enough truth to sting. I never meant for this to happen. The relationship, my feelings for Andrew are real. How convenient that your real feelings developed while you were photographing his signatures and documenting his business decisions. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes cold as winter steel. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to disappear from Andrew's life immediately. Today. No explanations, no tearful goodbyes, no contact ever again. I can't do that. Yes, you can, because if you don't, I'll claim you forged those documents you've been collecting. I'll testify that you seduced Andrew specifically to gain access to confidential business information for corporate espionage purposes. I'll destroy your credibility so completely that no prosecutor will touch your case. Imani felt the walls closing in as she realized the impossible position Victoria had created. You know those patents were stolen. You know your legal team committed fraud. What I know is that my son had nothing to do with any theft that may have occurred 20 years ago. He was 16 years old and has built this company through legitimate business practices. Victoria's voice was granite hard. I won't let him pay for crimes he didn't commit, especially not to satisfy your thirst for revenge. This isn't revenge, it's justice. Justice would have been pursuing the actual perpetrators instead of targeting an innocent man who happened to inherit the consequences of other people's crimes. Victoria stood, her posture radiating finality. You have until the end of business today to resign and disappear. If you're still here tomorrow, I'll begin the process of destroying you and everything you think you've accomplished. The meeting ended with Imani walking out on shaking legs, Victoria's ultimatum ringing in her ears. She had until 5 o'clock to choose between abandoning her father's justice and losing Andrew forever, or staying to fight and watching Victoria destroy any chance of criminal prosecution. The decision became even more impossible when Rick Caldwell called an hour later with his own ultimatum. Time's up, Miss Jefferson. I need your complete evidence file by end of business today, or I'll proceed with independent prosecution that exposes your identity anyway. I need more time. Time for what? To warn your boyfriend? To help him prepare defenses? Caldwell's voice was sharp with suspicion. You've had 18 months to gather evidence. Either you're committed to justice for your father, or you're not. It's complicated. It's simple. Either Andrew Quinn pays for profiting from stolen patents, or justice is denied again. Which matters more to you, your father's legacy, or your personal happiness? The conversation ended with Imani feeling trapped between impossible choices. Victoria would destroy her credibility if she stayed, but Caldwell would expose her identity if she didn't deliver the evidence file. Either way, Andrew would learn the truth, but one path led to his prosecution, while the other led to her complete destruction. That afternoon, she sat in Andrew's office during what might be their last private moment together, watching him review contracts with the trust and affection that had defined their relationship. When he looked up and smiled, the expression full of love and plans for their future, Imani felt her heart shatter with the weight of choices she could no longer avoid. You seem tense today, he observed, moving around his desk to pull her into his arms. Is everything all right, Andrew? She began, then stopped, unable to find words for the truth that would destroy everything between them. What is it? His concern was immediate and genuine, his protective instincts triggering as he sensed her distress. There are things about me, about why I came to work here, that you don't know. Then tell me. His voice was steady, confident in their love's ability to weather whatever revelation she was struggling to make. Whatever it is, we can handle it together. The tenderness in his response nearly broke her resolve. He was a man offering to fight battles he didn't understand, willing to face any truth for someone whose deception would destroy him. Some truths change everything. Not between us, he said firmly, his hands framing her face with the gentleness that had made her fall in love with him. I love you, Imani. Nothing you could tell me would change that. But even as he spoke those words with complete sincerity, Imani knew that everything was about to change in ways neither of them could prepare for. Victoria's deadline was approaching, Caldwell's pressure was mounting, and her pregnancy created complications that made every choice infinitely more devastating. The moment of truth was arriving, whether she was ready or not, and the woman who had come to Quinn Technologies seeking justice for her father was about to discover that some victories required sacrifices that might be too painful to bear. The explosion came at precisely 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, when Victoria Quinn arrived at Andrew's office, carrying a file folder that would destroy everything Imani thought she understood about family loyalty and corporate warfare. Andrew was reviewing quarterly projections when his mother swept in without knocking, her expression radiating the cold fury of someone who had discovered betrayal at the heart of her family's empire. We need to discuss your executive assistant, Victoria announced, setting the folder on Andrew's desk with deliberate precision. Mother, if this is another attempt to question Imani's qualifications, her qualifications are exactly what we need to discuss. Victoria opened the folder, revealing investigation reports, family photographs, and legal documents that made Andrew's blood turn to ice. Meet Marcus Jefferson's daughter. Andrew stared at the documents with growing confusion and dread. Birth certificate listing Marcus Jefferson as father. University transcripts for Imani Jefferson. Employment records showing systematic research into Quinn Technologies' patent portfolio. And photographs of a man whose face was hauntingly familiar, though Andrew couldn't place where he had seen it before. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Marcus Jefferson was the engineer whose patent portfolio formed the foundation of our licensing agreements 20 years ago," Victoria explained with surgical precision. "The brilliant innovator whose work mysteriously became available for acquisition just after his death. The man whose daughter has been systematically documenting your involvement in patent licensing decisions for 18 months. The truth hit Andrew like a physical blow. Every quarterly renewal ceremony Imani had documented with unusual thoroughness. Every question about patent authenticity that had seemed like professional curiosity. Every moment of tension when she handled documents bearing his signature. She hadn't been gathering evidence of abstract corporate fraud. She had been building a case against him personally for profiting from her father's stolen work. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice hollow with the recognition that everything he thought he knew about their relationship had been built on systematic deception. "I imagine she's deciding whether to disappear quietly or proceed with whatever prosecution she's been planning," Victoria replied. "Though given the evidence she's gathered, I suspect the choice may no longer be hers to make." Andrew's world was fracturing along fault lines he hadn't known existed. The woman he loved had been documenting his crimes while sleeping with him. Every intimate moment, every shared confidence, every declaration of love had occurred while she systematically built the case that would send him to prison. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for months. The investigation confirmed my suspicions yesterday." Victoria's voice softened slightly as she watched her son absorb the devastating revelations. "I'm sorry, Andrew. I know you care for her." "Care for her?" He laughed bitterly. "I was planning to propose. I was going to offer her a position as Chief Technology Officer. I was imagining our entire future together while she was documenting evidence to destroy me." The office door opened as Imani returned from her meeting with the doctor, her face pale with the weight of secrets she could no longer carry. When she saw Victoria and the open investigation file, her eyes closed in resignation rather than surprise. "Imani Jefferson," Andrew said, his voice carefully controlled. "Daughter of Marcus Jefferson, my executive assistant who's been gathering evidence of my involvement in patent fraud for 18 months. Andrew, is it true?" The question cut through her attempted explanation like a blade. "Have you been documenting my business decisions to build a criminal case against me?" The silence stretched between them, loaded with 18 months of shared intimacy that had been built on fundamental deception. When Imani finally met his eyes, the pain in her expression confirmed everything Victoria's investigation had revealed. "Yes," she whispered. The single word shattered something essential in Andrew's chest. "While we were together? While I was falling in love with you? While I was sharing things I've never told anyone else? It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Tears were streaming down her face now, but Andrew felt detached from the emotion that had defined their relationship. "The feelings between us are real. Everything we shared was real. Except the reason you came here. Except your interest in quarterly renewals. Except your career background. Except your name, apparently, since I assumed Jefferson wasn't coincidental." His voice grew sharper with each revelation. "What else was real, Imani? The late-night conversations? The moments when you comforted me about my dyslexia? The night we made love during the storm?" "All of it," she said desperately. "Every conversation, every moment of intimacy, every time I told you I loved you, all of it was real, built on a foundation of systematic deception designed to send me to prison." Victoria watched the confrontation with satisfaction tinged by sympathy for her son's pain. "Perhaps we should discuss this more privately." "No." Andrew's voice was granite hard. "I want to understand exactly what I've been involved in. Unknowingly, apparently. but involved nonetheless. He turned back to Imani with the same analytical focus he brought to business crises. Tell me about my father's firm. Tell me about Marcus Jefferson. Tell me about the patents that built Quinn Technologies. Imani drew a shaking breath, recognizing that the moment of complete truth had arrived, whether she was prepared or not. 20 years ago, my father worked for Jefferson Engineering, developing breakthrough technologies in energy efficiency and data processing. When he died suddenly, those patents disappeared into corporate legal files and eventually became the foundation of Quinn Technologies' licensing portfolio. My father's firm collapsed around the same time, Andrew said slowly, because he was another victim, not the perpetrator. The same legal conspiracy that stole my father's work destroyed yours. The words came out in a rush of desperate honesty. Rick Caldwell orchestrated everything: the patent theft, the destruction of both our father's companies, the legal framework that made you unknowingly complicit in ongoing fraud. Andrew felt the ground shifting beneath everything he had believed about his family's success. The quarterly renewals I'd been signing, if are licensing agreements for technology your father never owned, stolen from mine and laundered through 20 years of legal manipulation. Imani's voice broke with the weight of revelations that would destroy them both. Every signature you've placed on those documents creates legal liability for patent fraud conspiracy, regardless of your knowledge or intent. And you've been documenting that liability. Yes, the admission came out as barely a whisper. For 18 months, while pretending to love me. I wasn't pretending. She moved toward him instinctively, then stopped when she saw him recoil. I came here for justice, but I fell in love with you completely. The feelings between us are the only honest thing in this entire situation. Honest? Andrew's laugh was sharp with pain. You've been photographing my signatures to build a criminal case against me. How is that honest? Because I was trying to find another way. Because I was hoping to achieve justice without destroying you. Because every piece of evidence I gathered made me love you more and hate what I was doing. Victoria's voice cut through their emotional confrontation with cold practicality. Touching though this is, we need to discuss the legal implications. How much evidence have you gathered, and who are you working with? Imani's eyes darted between Andrew and his mother. Recognizing that complete honesty was her only remaining option. I have documentation of 8 quarterly renewal ceremonies, board meeting minutes, client communications, and witness statements proving systematic personal involvement in patent licensing decisions. Rick Caldwell has been coordinating the hostile takeover that will use this evidence to trigger federal prosecution. Federal prosecution? Andrew felt the walls closing in as the scope of his vulnerability became clear. You're talking about criminal charges? Patent fraud conspiracy. The evidence shows a pattern of personal involvement that meets federal guidelines for criminal liability. Imani's voice was steadier now, but her hands shook as she delivered the devastating news. Caldwell estimates 5 to 10 years prison time, plus complete asset forfeiture for victim restitution. The magnitude of his situation hit Andrew like a physical blow. Everything he had built, the company, the family estate, his financial security, would be destroyed. His learning disability wouldn't protect him from criminal liability when faced with documented evidence of systematic involvement in fraud. And you helped build this case while sleeping with me. I was trying to protect you while seeking justice for my father. The desperate honesty in her voice cut through his anger momentarily. I thought I could find evidence against the actual perpetrators without destroying you. But you didn't. No, she whispered. The legal structure makes you personally liable, regardless of intent or knowledge. Victoria's voice was ice cold as she delivered her ultimatum. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to resign immediately and disappear from Andrew's life. All contact between you ends today. In exchange, I won't pursue charges for corporate espionage and document fraud. Mother, Andrew began. This is business, not personal. Victoria cut him off. She came here to destroy you. The fact that she claims to have developed feelings doesn't change the fundamental deception. But Imani's next words changed everything in ways none of them anticipated. "There's something else you need to know." Andrew looked at her with wary exhaustion, wondering what additional devastation could possibly remain. What else could there be? "I'm pregnant." The three words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reshape everything they thought they understood about choices and consequences. Andrew stared at her with a mixture of wonder and devastation, while Victoria's face went white with the recognition that the situation had just become infinitely more complicated. "How far along?" Andrew asked quietly. 8 weeks. Imani's voice was barely audible. "I found out 3 days ago." The timing made everything worse. Their child had been conceived during the storm night when they had made love, while she documented evidence that would send him to prison. Their most intimate moment had occurred in the shadow of the betrayal that would destroy their future. "Is it mine?" The question was clinical, necessary, and painful for all of them. "Yes." Tears were streaming down her face as she watched the man she loved process the reality that their child would be born into the wreckage of everything they had built together. Andrew sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the convergence of love and betrayal, impending fatherhood and criminal prosecution, family loyalty and personal devastation. "Our baby will be born while I'm in federal prison for crimes I committed unknowingly. We can find another way," Imani said desperately. "There has to be another solution." "What solution?" Victoria's voice was sharp with family protectiveness. "You spent 18 months building a case against him. The evidence exists. Your co-conspirator is proceeding with hostile takeover, and now you're pregnant with his child, ensuring you'll be connected to this family forever." The accusation hit home because it contained enough truth to sting. Had Imani's pregnancy been part of some larger manipulation? Andrew found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about their relationship, their love, their shared future. "The pregnancy wasn't planned," Imani said, reading his thoughts. "I would never use a child as leverage in this situation." "But it does create leverage," Victoria pointed out coldly. "Suddenly you have permanent claim to Quinn family resources and Andrew's emotional loyalty, regardless of what legal consequences he faces." "I never wanted this," Imani whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of accusations and impossible circumstances. "I came here for justice, fell in love despite myself, and now I'm carrying the child of the man my evidence will send to prison." Andrew looked at the woman who carried his child while documenting his crimes, feeling his heart break and heal and break again in rapid succession. "Do you love me?" "Completely. More than my own life. But you're still going to provide evidence that sends me to federal prison." The silence that followed was answer enough. Imani's loyalty to her father's memory and her commitment to justice would require destroying the man she loved and the father of her child. There was no solution that satisfied both love and principle, no compromise that honored both the past and the future. "Choose," Andrew said quietly, his voice steady despite the devastation in his eyes. "Your father's justice or our child's father. You can't have both." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, requiring a choice that would define not only their futures but their characters. Imani looked at the man she loved completely, understanding finally that some battles could only be won by sacrificing everything that mattered most. The answer, when it came, would change all their lives forever. The answer came 48 hours later, delivered by federal marshals who arrived at Quinn Technologies with subpoenas that would freeze every asset and transform Andrew's world into a legal nightmare. Rick Caldwell's hostile takeover had launched precisely as threatened, using Imani's evidence file to trigger criminal referrals that would either destroy the Quinn empire or hand it to him at bankruptcy prices. "Mr. Quinn, you're being served with federal subpoenas for all company records relating to patent licensing agreements from the past 5 years," the lead marshal announced as Andrew's staff watched in stunned silence. "Additionally, all personal and corporate assets are frozen pending investigation into charges of patent fraud conspiracy." Andrew accepted the documents with steady hands despite the chaos erupting around him. Employees whispered in corners. Clients called demanding explanations, and media vans gathered outside as news of the federal investigation leaked within hours. Everything he had built over 20 years was crumbling in real time. Broadcast for public consumption. "Sir," his personal attorney said quietly, "we need to discuss your legal situation immediately." The emergency meeting in the conference room that afternoon delivered news that was somehow worse than Andrew had imagined. His legal team, led by senior partner David Morrison, had spent 48 hours reviewing the evidence Imani had gathered and the federal prosecutor's preliminary assessment. "The documentation is comprehensive and damaging," Morrison explained grimly. 8 quarterly renewal ceremonies with your personal signature, board meeting minutes showing your direct involvement in patent licensing decisions, client communications proving you personally managed intellectual property agreements. The pattern of involvement is clear and legally devastating. "But I never knew the patents were stolen," Andrew protested. "I trusted my family's legal team completely. My dyslexia made detailed technical review challenging, so I focused on business strategy while delegating legal compliance. Unfortunately, federal prosecutors don't focus on intent when they have documented evidence of systematic participation." Morrison's expression was grave as he delivered the worst news. The sentencing guidelines for patent fraud conspiracy range from 5 to 10 years, with asset forfeiture for victim restitution. Your learning disability might create mitigating circumstances, but it won't eliminate criminal liability. Victoria sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of the legal threat became clear. "You're saying my son could face a decade in federal prison for trusting the wrong lawyers?" The evidence shows a pattern of personal signatures authorizing fraudulent patent licensing over multiple years. From a prosecutor's perspective, that constitutes knowing participation in criminal conspiracy, regardless of underlying intent or capacity. Andrew felt the walls of his carefully constructed world collapsing inward. What about plea options? Federal prosecutors are offering a deal. Cooperate against your family's legal team and provide testimony about how the fraud was structured in exchange for reduced charges, probably 2 to 4 years instead of the full decade. And if I refuse to cooperate, then you face the maximum charges alone, while the actual architects of the fraud remain protected by attorney-client privilege and statute of limitations. The cruel irony wasn't lost on any of them. The same legal system that had enabled 20 years of fraud through technicalities and procedural protections was now demanding that Andrew choose between accepting responsibility for crimes he committed unknowingly or betraying the lawyers who had manipulated his trust to create those crimes. Outside the conference room, Imani waited in the reception area with the evidence file that had triggered this investigation. Her pregnancy was barely visible, but the weight of carrying Andrew's child while destroying his future showed in every line of her body. When their eyes met through the glass, the pain that passed between them encompassed everything they had lost and everything they would never have. "She's here," Victoria observed with cold fury. "The woman who destroyed our family while carrying our grandchild." "She didn't create this situation," Andrew said quietly. "She exposed it." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I sit, my son faces federal prison while she gets justice for her father and permanent claim to Quinn family resources through that baby." Andrew looked at his mother with exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "She's as trapped by the situation as we are. Do you think she wanted to fall in love with the man her evidence would destroy?" The federal prosecutor's office the following morning felt like a tribunal designed to crush everything Andrew had believed about justice and fairness. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh reviewed the evidence with clinical precision, while explaining exactly how the legal system would treat his situation. "Mr. Quinn, the documentation provided by Ms. Jefferson shows systematic personal involvement in patent licensing fraud spanning multiple years. Your signatures appear on quarterly renewals worth hundreds of millions in fraudulent licensing fees. The pattern of participation meets federal guidelines for criminal conspiracy charges." "I was unaware that the patents were stolen," Andrew insisted. I trusted my legal team's authenticity certifications completely. That may be true, but the law doesn't require knowledge of underlying fraud, only knowing participation in the fraudulent acts themselves. Your signatures on licensing agreements constitute that participation, regardless of your understanding of their legitimacy. Walsh's explanation crystallized the terrible truth about how the legal system actually functioned. Intent mattered less than documentation, knowledge less than participation, moral culpability less than prosecutorial expedience. Andrew was legally guilty of crimes he had committed unknowingly, and his learning disability would be treated as mitigation rather than defense. What are my options? Cooperate fully with our investigation into the law firm that structured these fraudulent arrangements. Provide testimony about how your signatures were obtained, what representations were made about patent authenticity, how your learning disability was exploited to create plausible deniability. In exchange, we'll recommend reduced charges and minimum security placement. And if I refuse, then you face the full conspiracy charges alone, while the actual architects of this fraud remain protected by attorney-client privilege and prosecutorial discretion. The meeting ended with Andrew understanding that his choice wasn't between guilt and innocence, but between degrees of legal destruction. He could cooperate and serve 2 years in minimum security, or maintain loyalty to his family's lawyers and face a decade in federal prison. Either way, his business would be destroyed, his assets seized, and his child born into the wreckage of everything he had built. How do you handle loving someone when circumstances seem designed to tear you apart? Share your stories below. The media explosion that followed transformed Andrew's legal nightmare into public spectacle. Corporate fraud investigations became front-page news when they involved visibly pregnant women at the center of family business scandals. Every detail of his relationship with Imani was dissected for public consumption, from their workplace romance to the timing of her pregnancy to the evidence she had gathered while sleeping with him. Pregnant secretary exposes CEO boyfriend's fraud empire, screamed the Seattle Times headline. Love and betrayal in tech company takedown, added the business journals. Dyslexic executive claims manipulation in patent fraud case, reported the legal newspapers. The coverage painted Andrew as either a criminal mastermind who had used his learning disability as cover for systematic fraud, or as a vulnerable man whose trust had been exploited by both family lawyers and romantic partners. Neither narrative captured the complex truth of how good people could become trapped in legal systems that prioritized documentation over justice. Victoria's response to the media attention was swift and devastating. My son is being targeted for prosecution by a woman who seduced him specifically to gather evidence for this case. The timing of her pregnancy, coinciding with federal charges, raises serious questions about her motivations and methods. The implication that Imani had deliberately become pregnant to strengthen her legal position sent Andrew into protective fury that surprised everyone, including himself. During his next public statement, he addressed the accusation directly. Imani Jefferson's pregnancy has nothing to do with these legal proceedings. She's a woman of integrity who found herself in an impossible situation between seeking justice for her father and protecting someone she loves. Any suggestion that she manipulated our relationship or planned her pregnancy for legal advantage is false and despicable. The statement effectively confirmed their romantic relationship while defending her character, but it also made his legal situation more complex. Federal prosecutors now had evidence that his relationship with the key witness involved deep emotional investment that could complicate testimony and plea negotiations. Meanwhile, Quinn Technologies was hemorrhaging clients, employees, and value as the investigation froze normal business operations. The company Andrew had spent 20 years building was being dismantled piece by piece while he faced the choice between cooperation that would betray family loyalty and resistance that would maximize his prison sentence. The final devastating blow came when Rick Caldwell emerged from the shadows to reveal the full scope of his manipulation. During a press conference designed to position himself as a victim seeking justice, he exposed details that made everyone's situation infinitely worse. 20 years ago, I was forced to participate in the theft of Marcus Jefferson's patents by corrupt lawyers who threatened my own family's financial security," Caldwell announced with calculated emotion. "I've spent 2 decades building the evidence needed to expose this conspiracy and return the stolen intellectual property to its rightful heirs." The revelation that Caldwell had been an unwilling participant rather than the criminal mastermind completely reframed the narrative. If his account was true, then everyone involved, Andrew's father, Marcus Jefferson, even Caldwell himself, had been victims of the same legal conspiracy that had manipulated family loyalties and financial desperation to enable systematic fraud. Ms. Jefferson's evidence gathering was essential to exposing this 20-year cover-up. Caldwell continued, "Without her courage and commitment to justice, the true perpetrators would have remained protected, while innocent people continued to pay for crimes they didn't commit." The implication was clear. Imani had been working with Caldwell, not to destroy Andrew, but to expose the lawyers who had manipulated multiple families to create legal liability while protecting themselves through procedural technicalities. Andrew wasn't the target of her investigation. He was another victim whose prosecution would force the real criminals into the light. But this revelation came too late to prevent the legal machinery that was already crushing everything Andrew had built. Federal prosecutors had their documented evidence, media attention had destroyed his business reputation, and asset forfeiture proceedings had begun that would strip away 20 years of work, regardless of ultimate guilt or innocence. That evening, in the empty Quinn Technologies office that had become a crime scene rather than a workplace, Andrew sat alone reviewing the quarterly renewal documents that had unknowingly sealed his fate. Each signature represented millions in licensing fees that had funded his family's lifestyle while creating legal liability that would destroy his future. When Imani appeared in his doorway, her pregnancy now visibly obvious and her expression devastated by the consequences of choices made long before they met, Andrew felt his heart break again for the impossibility of their situation. "I never wanted this," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was steady, despite the pain that threatened to overwhelm him. "You were seeking justice for your father. The fact that it destroyed everything between us doesn't make it wrong. It feels wrong. It feels like I betrayed the man I love to honor the memory of a father I lost." Andrew stood and moved toward her, noting how she instinctively placed protective hands over their growing child. "You didn't betray me, Imani. You exposed a truth that needed exposing. The fact that it hurts doesn't make it wrong. But it does make it tragic." "Yes," he agreed, reaching out to touch her face with the tenderness that had defined their relationship. "It makes it very tragic." They stood together in the office where they had fallen in love, while she documented evidence that would send him to prison, both understanding that some kinds of love were too powerful to be destroyed by circumstances, and too painful to survive them. The federal criminal trial began 6 months later in a Seattle courthouse that had become the epicenter of a case that would reshape how corporate fraud prosecutions handled exploitation of learning disabilities. Andrew entered the courtroom each morning, knowing that every piece of testimony would either vindicate his character or confirm his legal destruction, while Imani sat in the gallery carrying their child and the weight of evidence that had made this moment inevitable. The United States versus Andrew Quinn, announced Judge Patricia Harrison as the proceedings began. The defendant is charged with conspiracy to commit patent fraud, a federal felony carrying maximum sentences of 10 years imprisonment and complete asset forfeiture for victim restitution. Andrew's defense team, led by constitutional lawyer Sarah Chen, had spent months preparing a strategy that would expose the systematic exploitation that had made him legally liable for crimes he committed unknowingly. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. 8 quarterly renewal ceremonies with his personal signature, board meeting minutes documenting his involvement, client communications proving his management of fraudulent licensing agreements. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," began Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh during opening statements, "the evidence will show that Andrew Quinn personally authorized millions of dollars in licensing fees for stolen patents over multiple years. Regardless of his claimed ignorance, the pattern of systematic participation in this conspiracy is clear and legally decisive." The prosecution's case built methodically over the first week, with each piece of Imani's documentation creating another layer of legal liability. Federal agents testified about signature analysis. Forensic accountants explained the financial flows, and corporate witnesses described Andrew's direct involvement in patent licensing decisions. But it was Imani's testimony that created the most devastating and complex moments of the trial. As the key witness, whose evidence had triggered the investigation, she was required to explain 18 months of systematic documentation while pregnant with the defendant's child. "Miss Jefferson," Walsh asked during direct examination, "please describe your relationship with the defendant." "I was employed as his executive assistant," Imani replied carefully, her hands resting protectively over her visible pregnancy. "My responsibilities included coordinating quarterly patent renewal ceremonies and maintaining records of licensing agreement signatures." "Did your relationship with Mr. Quinn extend beyond professional duties?" The question hung in the courtroom air like a weapon, designed to expose the personal complexity that made this case unlike any federal fraud prosecution in recent memory. "Yes," Imani answered quietly. "We developed a personal relationship." "While you were documenting evidence of his criminal activity?" Defense attorney Sarah Chen objected immediately. "Your Honor, the question assumes facts not in evidence and is designed to prejudice the witness." "Sustained," Judge Harrison ruled. "Counsel will rephrase." Walsh approached from a different angle. "Ms. Jefferson, did your personal feelings for the defendant affect your evidence gathering?" Imani looked directly at Andrew for the first time since taking the stand, and the pain that passed between them was visible to everyone in the courtroom. "My feelings made the documentation more difficult emotionally, but they didn't change the accuracy of the evidence. You photographed his signature on fraudulent licensing agreements while in a romantic relationship with him?" "Yes." "You documented his personal involvement in patent fraud conspiracy while carrying his child?" "Yes." The admission created a moment of stunned silence in the courtroom, as the jury absorbed the unprecedented nature of a prosecution built on evidence gathered by the defendant's pregnant partner. But Walsh's next question revealed the complexity that made simple moral judgments impossible. "Ms. Jefferson, why did you continue gathering evidence despite your personal relationship with the defendant?" Imani drew a shaking breath before answering. "Because my father's life work was stolen, and the theft needed to be exposed regardless of personal consequences. Justice for victims can't depend on the romantic feelings of witnesses." Her testimony continued for 2 days, covering every aspect of Andrew's involvement in quarterly renewals, while revealing the emotional torture of loving someone whose legal destruction her evidence would ensure. When Sarah Chen began cross-examination, she focused on the exploitation that had made Andrew vulnerable to manipulation. "Miss Jefferson, you're aware that Mr. Quinn has dyslexia that makes detailed document analysis challenging?" "Yes." "You observed him struggle with technical patent specifications during your employment?" "Yes." "He focused on business strategy while trusting his legal team for technical compliance. Did you ever see evidence that he understood the patents he was licensing were stolen?" Imani was quiet for a long moment, recognizing that her answer could determine whether the man she loved faced 2 years or 10 years in federal prison. "No." His trust in family lawyers appeared complete and genuine. "So the man you documented committing patent fraud conspiracy appeared to be unaware that fraud was occurring?" "Objection," Walsh interrupted. "Calls for speculation about the defendant's mental state." "I'll rephrase," Chen replied. "Miss Jefferson, based on 18 months of observation, did Mr. Quinn's behavior suggest someone who knew he was participating in criminal activity?" "No," Imani answered honestly. "His behavior suggested someone who trusted legal advisors to handle compliance while he managed business relationships." The cross-examination revealed the terrible irony at the heart of the case. The prosecution's key witness, despite gathering overwhelming evidence of criminal participation, had never observed behavior suggesting criminal intent. Andrew's legal liability was clear, but his moral culpability remained ambiguous, even to the woman who loved him. The trial's most devastating moment came when Victoria Quinn took the stand to explain how her family's legal team had structured the patent acquisitions 20 years earlier. Her testimony revealed a level of manipulation that shocked even experienced federal prosecutors. "Mrs. Quinn," Chen asked during direct examination, "please describe your family's relationship with the law firm of Morrison, Walsh & Associates. They've handled all Quinn family legal matters for 30 years. Victoria replied with the dignity of someone determined to protect her son despite personal cost. "My late husband trusted them completely with patent acquisitions and business formation. Were you aware of how the patents that formed Quinn Technologies Foundation were acquired?" Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "I was told they were purchased legitimately from engineering firms that were dissolving due to financial difficulties." "Did you have reason to question those representations?" "My husband was grieving the collapse of his own engineering firm. When Morrison's office presented opportunities to acquire valuable patent portfolios, it seemed like justice, building something new from the wreckage of his failure." Chen's next questions exposed the systematic exploitation that had trapped multiple families in legal liability while protecting the actual architects of the fraud. "Mrs. Quinn, did Morrison's office explain that your son's learning disability would make him vulnerable to signing documents he couldn't fully comprehend?" "Objection," Walsh interrupted, but Judge Harrison allowed the question. "They suggested that Andrew's dyslexia made him an ideal business figurehead because he would focus on strategic relationships while trusting legal experts for technical compliance." Victoria answered, her voice breaking with the recognition of how her son's vulnerability had been weaponized. "So your family's lawyers deliberately positioned your son to sign documents he couldn't fully analyze?" "Yes. They called it delegated expertise, and said it would protect him from liability if questions arose about technical compliance." The testimony revealed the cruel sophistication of the legal conspiracy that had made Andrew personally liable for crimes orchestrated by others. His dyslexia hadn't been accommodated. It had been exploited to create plausible deniability for the lawyers who structured fraudulent transactions while ensuring their client bore legal responsibility. When Morrison himself testified under immunity, his explanations confirmed the worst fears about how learning disabilities could be manipulated within legal systems designed to protect procedural compliance over substantive justice. "Mr. Morrison," Chen asked, "did you structure Mr. Quinn's signature authority to take advantage of his reading challenges?" "I structured his involvement to ensure legal compliance with corporate governance requirements," Morrison replied with practiced evasion. "By requiring his personal signature on documents you knew he couldn't fully analyze? By ensuring that corporate decision-making included appropriate executive authorization as required by law, while knowing that his dyslexia made independent verification of document content impossible?" Morrison's pause was telling. "Mr. Quinn's learning challenges were accommodated through our office's technical review and legal certification processes." "Accommodated or exploited?" "Objection," Walsh called, but the question had already revealed the truth that defense lawyers and prosecutors both understood. Andrew's disability had been used as a tool to create legal liability while protecting the actual criminals through attorney-client privilege and procedural technicalities. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with a verdict that satisfied no one, while acknowledging the complex realities of exploitation within legal systems. They found Andrew guilty of patent fraud conspiracy, but recommended minimum sentencing due to evidence of systematic manipulation of his learning disability. "Mr. Quinn," Judge Harrison announced during sentencing, "the evidence clearly establishes your participation in patent fraud spanning multiple years. However, testimony regarding the exploitation of your learning disability creates substantial mitigating circumstances that warrant departure from standard sentencing guidelines." Andrew stood with Sarah Chen as his fate was determined by judicial discretion that would shape how federal courts handled future cases involving learning disabilities and corporate fraud. "I sentence you to 18 months in minimum security federal prison, followed by 2 years supervised release with community service focused on disability advocacy. Additionally, you are required to make full restitution to victims." Though the court recognizes that asset forfeiture proceedings have already exceeded the financial harm caused by your actions. This sentence was simultaneously a victory and a destruction. Andrew would serve less than 2 years instead of the potential decade, but his business was gone, his assets seized, and his child would be born while he was imprisoned for crimes he had committed unknowingly. As court officers prepared to escort him to federal custody, Andrew looked at Imani one final time, seeing tears streaming down her face as she watched the father of her child led away in handcuffs. Victoria sat in stunned silence, recognizing that protecting her son from one form of exploitation had exposed him to another. The trial's aftermath would reshape federal prosecution guidelines for cases involving learning disabilities, but those reforms came too late to change Andrew's fate. He would serve his sentence while Imani raised their child alone, both understanding that justice sometimes required sacrifices too painful to bear, but too necessary to avoid. In the hallway outside the courtroom, as media cameras captured every moment of their separation, Andrew managed one final exchange with the woman who had gathered evidence that destroyed him while loving him completely. "Take care of our baby," he said quietly. "I will," she promised, her voice breaking, "and I'll make sure they know their father is a good man who was trapped by circumstances beyond his control." It was both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of a love story built on deception, and the start of a family scattered by the pursuit of justice that had consumed everyone it touched. Federal Correctional Institution Sheridan was a minimum security facility designed for white-collar offenders, but no amount of institutional comfort could ease the pain of separation from the woman Andrew loved and the child he would miss being born. His first letter to Imani, written on prison stationery that felt like sandpaper between his fingers, attempted to bridge a gap that seemed insurmountable. "I don't blame you for the choices you made," he wrote in careful handwriting that took twice as long due to his dyslexia. "You sought justice for your father, and justice is what you achieved. The fact that it required destroying everything between us doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it heartbreaking." Imani's response came 3 weeks later, her familiar handwriting blurred by tears she had cried while writing. "I think about you every day and hate myself for the evidence that put you there. But I also think about our daughter. Yes, it's a girl. And try to imagine explaining someday why her father is in prison, because her mother did what she believed was right." Their correspondence became a lifeline that sustained both of them through the 18 months of separation. Andrew wrote about literacy programs he had started for inmates with learning disabilities, sharing strategies that helped grown men read legal documents for the first time in their lives. Imani wrote about her pregnancy, their daughter's birth, and the modest apartment she had rented using royalties from her father's restored patent portfolio. "I named her Lucia," Imani wrote when their daughter was 2 months old. "It means light in Latin, and she seems determined to live up to it. She has your eyes but my stubborn chin, and she already shows signs of being intellectually curious about everything she encounters." Andrew treasured every photograph, every detail about milestones he was missing. When Lucia smiled for the first time, when she rolled over, when she began recognizing voices on video calls, all of it reached him through prison mail that made his heart soar and break simultaneously. The federal investigation's aftermath had indeed reshaped prosecution guidelines for cases involving learning disabilities. Though the reforms came too late to help Andrew, his case became precedent for requiring independent verification that defendants with documented learning disabilities understood the documents they signed, protecting future victims of similar exploitation. Your sacrifice is helping other people avoid the same trap. Imani wrote 6 months into his sentence. The Morrison law firm has been disbanded. 3 partners face criminal charges, and new federal guidelines require disability accommodations in corporate fraud cases. Justice for your situation came too late, but it will protect others. Meanwhile, Victoria Quinn had undergone her own transformation through grief and recognition of how her protective instincts had nearly destroyed her son. Her visits to the federal facility were initially tense, but gradually became opportunities for healing conversations that addressed 20 years of family dynamics. "I was wrong about Imani," Victoria admitted during one visiting session. "I thought she was targeting you deliberately, but she was as trapped by circumstances as you were. Her love for you is genuine, and her commitment to justice was necessary, even when it was painful." "It took me months to understand that both things could be true," Andrew replied. "She could love me completely and still do what justice required. The fact that it destroyed our happiness doesn't make it wrong." Victoria's evolution included reaching out to Imani with tentative offers of support that grew into unexpected friendship. "Your son is serving time for crimes he committed unknowingly," Imani wrote in response to Victoria's first letter. "But he's also becoming a voice for people whose vulnerabilities are exploited by systems designed to protect procedures rather than people." The relationship between the two women developed slowly, built on shared love for Andrew and growing understanding of how complicated moral choices could become when family loyalty conflicted with principles of justice. Victoria began visiting Lucia regularly, providing grandmother's love while respecting Imani's independence. "She's so much like Andrew," Victoria wrote to her son, "intellectually curious, ethically principled, and determined to understand how things work before accepting explanations. She also has your protective instincts. Yesterday, she tried to defend a smaller child at daycare from playground bullies." Andrew's prison experience became an unexpected education in how learning disabilities affected people throughout the criminal justice system. His literacy programs expanded from basic reading instruction to advocacy for policy changes that would prevent exploitation of vulnerable defendants. "I've learned more about justice in federal prison than I did in 20 years of corporate success," he wrote to Imani. "Real justice requires protecting people who can't protect themselves, not just punishing people who get caught. Your father's case taught me that, even though the lesson came through personal destruction." His advocacy work attracted attention from disability rights organizations and legal reform groups, creating opportunities for post-release employment that would allow him to rebuild his life around principles rather than profit. "Several nonprofits have offered positions when I'm released," he wrote. "The irony isn't lost on me that going to prison for unknowing crimes is creating opportunities to prevent those crimes from happening to other people." Imani's own transformation included building Quinn Jefferson Technologies, using her father's restored patents and Andrew's business knowledge, shared through their correspondence. "I'm creating the company we both dreamed about," she wrote. "Ethical technology development that honors innovation while protecting inventors' rights." Their video calls, initially awkward and painful, gradually became intimate conversations that rebuilt their emotional connection despite physical separation. Lucia learned to recognize her father's voice and would babble happily during calls, reaching toward the screen as if trying to touch the man who sang lullabies through prison internet connections. "She knows you," Imani observed during one call when Lucia was 8 months old. "When I play recordings of you reading stories, she stops crying and focuses completely on your voice. She understands somehow that you're important to her, even though she's never been held by you." The approaching release date created both anticipation and anxiety for all of them. Andrew would emerge from prison with federal supervision requirements, community service obligations, and the challenge of rebuilding relationships that had been sustained through letters and video calls for 18 months. "I don't know what to expect when you come home," Imani wrote as his release approached. "We've grown and changed during the separation. I've become a single mother and business owner. You've become a disability rights advocate. Lucia is walking and talking and has never known a world where her father wasn't in prison." Andrew's response addressed the uncertainty that both of them felt about reuniting after 18 months of separation. "I know we're different people than we were when this started, but I also know that real love survives transformation. And what we built together was real, despite the circumstances that tore us apart." The final weeks of his sentence included preparation for supervised release that would allow him to rebuild relationships while serving community requirements focused on disability advocacy. His literacy programs had become permanent fixtures at the federal facility, and his advocacy work had created legislative proposals that would prevent future exploitation of defendants with learning disabilities. Your imprisonment has created positive change that will protect countless other people, Imani wrote in her final letter before his release. That doesn't justify what happened to you, but it gives meaning to the sacrifice we've all made. Victoria's last visit before Andrew's release included bringing Lucia to see her father through prison glass, creating the first direct interaction between father and daughter that both of them would remember. The 15-month-old girl pressed her hands against the partition, while Andrew matched them from his side, both crying with the recognition of connection that transcended physical barriers. "Daddy," Lucia said clearly, her first word addressed to the man she had known only through photographs and video calls. The word broke Andrew's heart and healed it simultaneously, proving that love could survive separation and that family bonds could form despite impossible circumstances. As his release date arrived, he carried 18 months of letters, thousands of photographs, and the knowledge that the woman he loved had built a life that included space for his return. The reunion that awaited them would test whether love strengthened by separation could overcome the trauma of everything they had endured together, and whether their daughter could bridge the gap between past pain and future hope. On the morning of his release, Andrew walked out of federal prison carrying a box of letters that documented 18 months of love sustained through the worst circumstances imaginable. Ready to discover whether the family scattered by his prosecution could be rebuilt through the principles that had survived their destruction. The morning of Andrew's release dawned gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that felt appropriate for a reunion built on love, tested by ultimate sacrifice. Imani waited outside Federal Correctional Institution Sheridan with Lucia strapped to her chest, both of them watching the gates that would return the man they loved to a world that had changed dramatically during his 18-month absence. "Daddy," Lucia babbled, her 15-month-old vocabulary now including the words she had learned to associate with the voice that sang lullabies through video calls and the face that smiled at her from photographs covering their apartment walls. When Andrew emerged carrying a single box of personal belongings, the 18 months of separation collapsed into a moment of recognition that transcended all the pain they had endured. He was thinner, his dark hair now showing silver at the temples, but his steel-gray eyes held the same love and integrity that had made Imani fall for him, despite her mission of justice. Their first embrace was tentative, both aware that they were different people than they had been when federal marshals led him away in handcuffs. But when Lucia reached for him with the trust that only children possess, Andrew felt his heart expand with joy that made every sacrifice worthwhile. "She knows you," Imani whispered, as Lucia settled into her father's arms with complete comfort. "She's been waiting for this moment since she learned to understand that you were coming home." Andrew held his daughter with wonder and gratitude, recognizing that this small person represented the future they had fought to protect through 18 months of separation. "Thank you," he said to Imani, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for keeping our family together when everything else fell apart." The modest apartment Imani had rented using royalties from her father's restored patents was a far cry from the luxury they had once known, but it felt like a palace compared to federal prison. Lucia toddled between them with delight, showing her father toys and books while babbling in the mixed English and gibberish that marked her stage of development. "Tell me about Quinn Jefferson Technologies," Andrew said, as they shared coffee while Lucia napped, both of them marveling at the domestic normalcy that had seemed impossible 18 months earlier. "It's small but growing," Imani replied, pride evident in her voice. "We're developing energy efficiency solutions using your father's restored patents, combined with ethical business practices that prioritize innovation over profit maximization. Current contracts worth about $2 million annually, with projections for steady growth." Andrew smiled at the irony that their mutual destruction had created the foundation for exactly the kind of company they had dreamed about building together. Ethical technology development that honors both innovation and inventors' rights. Exactly what we talked about during those late nights in your old office. The memory carried both sweetness and pain, acknowledgement of how their love had developed despite the deception that ultimately exposed necessary truth. Their first weeks together were a careful dance of rediscovering each other, while building family routines that included Lucia's needs and Andrew's supervised release requirements. His community service, focused on disability advocacy, created purpose that transformed his punishment into meaningful work, protecting other vulnerable people from exploitation. The literacy programs you developed at Sheridan are being implemented at federal facilities nationwide, Imani told him as they watched Lucia play in their small living room. Your advocacy work has created policy changes that will prevent other people with learning disabilities from being exploited the way you were. Justice delayed, but not denied, Andrew replied, understanding finally that his suffering had meaning beyond personal punishment. Your father's stolen work is restored. Exploitation of learning disabilities is being addressed through legal reform, and we're building something together that honors both our families' legacies. Victoria's integration into their rebuilt family happened gradually, with tentative offers of help that grew into genuine relationships based on shared love for Andrew and Lucia. Her first visit to their modest apartment was awkward, but Lucia's uninhibited affection for her grandmother created bridges that adult complications couldn't destroy. I was wrong about everything, Victoria admitted, during one evening visit as they watched Lucia toddle between her parents with pure joy. I thought protecting Andrew meant hiding from truth, but truth was what ultimately protected him. Your evidence gathering exposed exploitation that could have continued for decades. We were all trying to protect the people we loved, Imani replied, understanding finally that Victoria's hostility had been maternal fear rather than personal malice. Sometimes protection requires facing painful truths rather than avoiding them. The criminal justice reforms, triggered by Andrew's case, continued creating positive change throughout the federal system. New guidelines required independent verification that defendants with documented learning disabilities understood documents they signed, protecting future victims of similar exploitation while acknowledging that intent mattered in determining appropriate punishment. Your sacrifice is helping other families avoid the same destruction, Imani observed, as they read news coverage of the latest policy implementations. The Morrison law firm partners received substantial prison sentences, while defendants who were exploited like you received reduced charges and disability accommodations. Andrew's work with the National Center for Learning Disabilities had expanded from prison advocacy to legislative testimony that shaped federal policy protecting vulnerable defendants. His visibility as someone who had served time for unknowing crimes while advocating for systemic change created credibility that purely academic experts couldn't match. Congress is considering the Quinn-Jefferson Act, he told Imani with amazement one evening as Lucia climbed on his lap during story time. Federal legislation requiring disability impact assessments for any prosecution involving learning disabilities, named after both our fathers who were exploited by the same system. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their personal destruction had created legislative momentum for protecting other families from similar exploitation. Their love story, built on deception and tested by separation, had ultimately created positive change that would outlast their personal pain. Quinn-Jefferson Technologies grew steadily under Imani's leadership, with Andrew contributing business strategy during evenings and weekends while fulfilling his community service obligations. Their partnership had evolved from employer-employee to romantic relationship to co-parents, building ethical business practices that honored both innovation and justice. We're profitable, sustainable, and creating technology that actually helps people, Imani reported during one of their evening planning sessions. Solar efficiency patents that reduce energy costs for low-income housing, data processing innovations that protect privacy rights, manufacturing processes that prioritize worker safety over cost minimization. Everything we dreamed about when we were falling in love in my old office, Andrew replied, marveling at how their destruction had cleared the way for authentic success. Except now it's built on complete honesty instead of hidden agendas. Their physical relationship had been rebuilt slowly, with tenderness that acknowledged the trauma they had both endured, while celebrating the love that had survived ultimate testing. When they made love in their modest bedroom, while Lucia slept nearby, the intimacy carried deeper meaning than their passionate encounters in luxury offices had possessed. I love who we've become, Imani whispered one night as they held each other in the aftermath of reunion that felt like both homecoming and new beginning. We're better people than we were before all this happened. Stronger individually and together, Andrew agreed, understanding that their love had been forged through fire that burned away everything except what was essential. We know now that we can survive anything as long as we face it honestly. Lucia's second birthday celebration took place in their apartment with Victoria, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and friends from Andrew's advocacy work, creating the kind of chosen family that emerges from shared principles rather than shared privilege. As they watched their daughter blow out candles with determined concentration, both parents understood that they had given her something more valuable than material wealth, the knowledge that integrity and love could overcome any obstacle. "Look what we built," Imani said quietly as the party continued around them. Andrew followed her gaze around the modest apartment, filled with people who had supported them through impossible circumstances, their daughter playing happily with toys bought through honest income, walls covered with family photographs that included prison visiting room pictures alongside celebration moments. "We built something real," he replied, pulling her closer. "Something that can't be destroyed by external circumstances because it's based on who we actually are, rather than what we own or what we're afraid to lose." Their wedding ceremony took place 6 months later in the small community center where Andrew conducted literacy classes, surrounded by formerly incarcerated people whose lives he had impacted and families affected by learning disability exploitation. Lucia toddled down the aisle as flower girl, scattering petals with the joy of someone who had known from birth that love could overcome any obstacle. "I take you as my husband," Imani said during vows they had written together, "knowing that you're a man who chose integrity over safety, justice over comfort, and love over everything else that seemed important." "I take you as my wife," Andrew replied, "knowing that you're a woman who sought truth even when it was painful, protected justice even when it required sacrifice, and loved me completely despite the consequences." Victoria cried during the ceremony, understanding finally that her son's happiness had been achieved through losing everything she had tried to protect. Dr. Sarah Mitchell smiled with maternal pride at seeing her daughter marry a man who had proven his character through ultimate testing. As they danced to their first song as husband and wife, Lucia sleeping peacefully in Victoria's arms nearby, Andrew and Imani understood that they had achieved something rare, love that had been tested by every possible adversity and emerged stronger, more authentic, and completely unshakable. "We did it," Imani whispered against his ear as they swayed together. "We survived everything," Andrew agreed, holding her close. "And we're going to build something beautiful with whatever time we have left." Quinn Jefferson Technologies continued growing. Their family expanded their impact through advocacy work, and Lucia grew up knowing that her parents had chosen each other and justice over safety and convenience. Their love story became proof that authentic happiness required authentic sacrifice, but that sacrifice willingly made for principles and love created foundations that could withstand any storm. The company they built together ultimately employed hundreds of people. The legislation they inspired protected thousands of vulnerable defendants, and their daughter inherited the knowledge that real strength comes from facing truth rather than avoiding it. 5 years after their reunion, as they stood in the offices of Quinn Jefferson Technologies, watching Lucia help other children with learning challenges through the foundation they had established, Andrew and Imani understood that their destruction had been the price of creating something genuinely meaningful. "Your father would be proud," Andrew said as they observed their daughter teaching reading strategies to younger children with dyslexia. "Both our fathers would be proud," Imani replied, understanding that justice delayed had not been justice denied, but justice that required sacrifice to achieve lasting change. Their love had survived every test, their principles had created positive change, and their daughter was growing up in a world made better by parents who had chosen integrity over everything else that once seemed important. And so we discover that the most powerful love stories aren't about avoiding sacrifice. They're about embracing it willingly, when principles and authentic connection demand nothing less. Andrew and Imani's journey reminds us that real strength comes from facing truth, even when it destroys everything we think we want, and that love tested by ultimate adversity becomes unshakable in ways that comfort never could. Their daughter Lucia grew up knowing that her parents had chosen integrity over safety, justice over convenience, and each other over everything else the world told them was important. She inherited something more valuable than wealth or status, the knowledge that authentic happiness requires authentic sacrifice, and that sacrifice, made willingly for love and justice, creates foundations that can weather any storm. Sometimes, the greatest victories require losing everything we thought mattered to discover what actually does. Andrew and Imani found that truth together, and in finding it, they built something beautiful that will outlast any empire built on deception. Have you ever had to sacrifice everything for love or principle? What would you choose, safety and comfort, or fighting for what's right? How has facing consequences together strengthened your most important relationships? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for tomorrow's tale of love, conquering impossible odds through authentic sacrifice. Ring the notification bell so you never miss these stories of courage, love, and the choices that define who we truly are. Thank you for being part of our Royal Story family. Until tomorrow, remember that real love isn't about avoiding difficult choices, it's about making them together.